So, as some of you know, Sun Tzu's teachings come from ancient China, from a time and place that's very different from our own. And yet the reason why we still read Sun Tzu's The Art of War is because it has a timeless quality. It deals with particular strategies and tactics, yes, but at an abstract enough level that they are fairly easily transferable, not only to situations of physical battle in our own times, but also other situations of conflict. And there's something that Sun Tzu knew that we still need to learn today, I think, because the mistake gets repeated over and over again, is that people will get into a groove of thinking and behavior, and they will not get knocked off that groove and change unless they are absolutely forced to do so. That's how much people love to have the same basic milieu. Michael Oakeshott famously said that all people tend to be conservative by nature, meaning that by nature we just like things to stay the same. And if we try to change people too quickly, he thought that you could do a lot of harm, because that's how much this is human nature. But yet at the same time, if people don't change at all, they do themselves harm. And so there has to be some mechanism of adjustment. And this is something that classical conservative thinkers spend a lot of time trying to figure out. But the problem is that there are times when people have to change, but they're still stuck in the same old groove. Sun Tzu was living during one of those times, and I think that's one of the reasons this work got created. Sun Tzu lived during a time in which the powers of China were consolidating, and the armies were getting larger, and the technology was improving and getting more deadly. And they were all doing this change, but at the same time, the mentality of how battle should go had not completely changed, and those leaders who still had some of these old-fashioned notions were put at a disadvantage. A somewhat similar situation to medieval Europe. As the fighting forces got bigger and as the weaponry improved and battle became more deadly, still they tried to go out and parley before the battle and, dress accordingly so that people would know the enemy from the ally, etc. And those who were willing to break those rules were going to win. So Sun Tzu writes this book partly as a sort of wake-up call, I think, to say, look, things have changed and we have to change our mentality accordingly. And some of the things that he says are very shocking, I think, maybe to the people of his time. One of those things is this concept of death ground. You find this in chapter 11 of The Art of War. And in the translation I have, it's called desperate ground, but in other translations it's called death ground, and it means death ground. When people are faced with the very likely possibility that they will die, where their backs are up against the wall. He says, ground on which we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay is desperate ground, or death ground. On desperate ground, fight. So he's gone through other types of ground, some of which are easy to deal with and some of which are harder. One of which, the one right before this, is ground in which there's a sort of bottleneck, difficult ground, or hemmed-in ground, he puts it. where ground is reached through narrow gorges, and we'll talk a bit about that in a moment. But desperate ground is where we can only be saved from destruction by fighting without delay, he says. Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight, he says. Well, no kidding, because flight is impossible in that situation, and there is no choice. But he doesn't, this isn't some suicidal teaching here, as much as I think there's some anecdotes out there about, whole armies killing themselves to make a point. I don't think anything in Sun Tzu's teaching makes that a good choice. So we're not talking about that, but that at a certain point, when death is certain or almost certain, Sun Tzu senses that there is a shift in the mentality of people where they transcend themselves, where the courage that they find is a different kind of courage. He says if they face death, there is nothing they may not achieve. Officers and men alike will put forth their uttermost strength. So it's a type of courage that does not come in ordinary situations. And so this is the first quality of death ground. There's some other quotes that he gives in this chapter that give us a sense of the quality of this situation and how it differs from most ordinary situations that we may find ourselves in, which we may think are desperate, but not like this. I dare say most of us have never experienced a situation like this, at least not consciously. There may have been times when we should have, but we avoided thinking about it. Anyway, he says, at a critical moment, the leader of an army acts like one who has climbed up a height and then kicks away the ladder behind him. He carries his men deep into hostile territory before he shows his hand. He burns his boats and he breaks his cooking pots. Like a shepherd driving a flock of sheep, he drives his men this way and that, and nothing knows whither he is going. Well, you may wonder, at a general like that, is that responsible? I mean, it's one thing to find yourself in death ground or desperate ground by accident or because the enemy corners you, but he's talking about a general putting the people in harm's way, the soldiers, in order to get the most out of them. So, I don't know, this is a debatable concept in Sun Tzu. It seems wrong, but at least it does point out something that Sun Tzu thinks is obvious about human psychology, and that is when there really doesn't seem to be any other option, something special comes out. And so in this case, Sun Tzu is recommending that the general take advantage of that. Take advantage of that incredible courage, that sort of superhuman resolve. Also, in this chapter, he says, when there is no place of refuge at all, it is death ground. At a critical moment, the leader of an army acts like one who has climbed up a height and kicks away the ladder. Okay, I read that before, but I wanted to make a point about that, that there's a parallel there. I'm sure there's many parallels, but one of those parallels occurs in a work I'm really familiar with, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War. In the Corcyraean Revolution and the battle between the Corcyraean people then and the oligarchs, the wealthy. This was a very deadly, horrible civil war. And at one point the oligarchs got the upper hand. And they did so in the same way that Sun Tzu is speaking of death ground. He says, Thucydides writes, after the departure of Eurymedon and the Athenian fleet, the surviving oligarchs, who to the number of 500 had escaped, seized certain forts on the mainland, and thus became masters of the territory on the opposite coast which belonged to Corcyra. Thence issuing forth, they plunged plundered the Corcyraeans in the island and did much harm, so that there was a great famine in the city. They also sent ambassadors to Lacedaemon and Corinth, begging that they might be restored, but failing of their object, they procured boats and auxiliaries and passed over to Corcyra, about 600 in all, then burning their boats, that they might have no hope, but in the conquest of the island they went on into Mount Istone, and building a fort there, became the masters of the country, to the ruin of the inhabitants of the city. Now later on things didn't fare as well for the oligarchs, but at this point that strategy was successful. And notice, no general made this decision, at least as Thucydides relates. They made this decision together as a group of 600 men who decided that they were going to basically just throw all caution to the wind and no turning back. They were going to show their resolve by making it impossible to turn back, and in this way they mustered the courage it took to defeat the people and establish their base on the mountain. So it also, this similarly happened, this sort of thing happened at the Battle of Thermopylae. And I don't need to relate that in detail here, because everybody probably is familiar with the story of the 300 Spartans who faced off against the Persian hordes of Xerxes. The Spartans had other troops accompanying them, but in the end, when they knew that Xerxes was going to find a way around this narrow pass that they had funneled his troops into, the Spartans told those other troops to leave, to save themselves, to fight another day, but that they would stay and they would hold this pass as long as they possibly could. One group stayed behind with them, and I forget the name of those people, but otherwise the Spartans were at the forefront of holding off Xerxes. And Xerxes sent in his stringers or whatever, his least capable people, because he thought, well, the Spartans they're just 300 or so, no big deal. The Spartans slaughtered them. He sent in the sort of B-grade guys. Spartans slaughtered them. Then he sends in his immortals, which are his elite troops. Well, they give him a hard time. Eventually, though, as the Persians just keep coming, of course, eventually the Spartans succumb. But they go out with everything. They use everything that they have. And they get down to the point where they're disarmed and they're literally throwing stones at the Persians. So they sacrifice themselves, but showing how much damage they can do, did great damage to the morale of the Persians and was greatly beneficial to the morale of the Greeks. And eventually this is one of the reasons why the Greeks are able to repel the Persians and gain their independence back. And so that's just another example of death ground, a really, really famous example of death ground. But there are ordinary examples of death ground too. In our everyday news, sometimes we hear of guys, men and women, who do incredible things on the spur of the moment, out of the adrenaline rush of having to make a split decision to either help someone or let them die. Here's a picture of some guys literally doing something they probably physically shouldn't be able to do, which is lifting a car off of a child. I remember a long time ago hearing about a guy who at the very last minute leaped into the path of an oncoming subway train in order to knock a man down and flatten him out. He flattened him out and laid on top of him, and that train rolled right over the top of him. Well, at that moment, I dare say that man had lived his entire life. He had lived a good life. If he had died, and I'm sure this ran through his mind, if he had died, he would have lived a good life. the best life. So you can see that death ground brings a sort of a higher level of courage, a higher level of resolve than people are normally capable of. The Israelites experienced death ground as the Egyptians chased them into the Red Sea. And they were told by Moses, who was told by God, who put them in this situation, I guess God is the general in this case, don't be afraid, move forward. Well, with the Egyptians running behind them, trying to catch up to destroy them, they really didn't have much choice but to hope and put their trust in God and move on forward. And lo and behold, the Red Sea opened. In that case, a miracle occurred. But still, they were afraid. They wanted to turn back. They were crying out. And they were tested. And they found that they were capable of it. A final example, a little closer to home as well, is from the Battle of Normandy. On the beaches of Normandy, those guys that had to get off the carriers, I don't know what they're called, but you've all seen the pictures of these things, moving up to the shore, but they couldn't get terribly close to the shore because they would have run aground. And so these poor guys had to get out and wade through a whole lot of water to get to the beach. They were vulnerable and exposed the entire time. And worst of all, they knew before they got there exactly what they were facing. They were facing oncoming fire the entire time. There were bullets hitting those boats, and they knew that once that door was open and they were going off to wade into that water, bullets were going to be flying, and they could very well simply get hit before they even got off the boat. But if you think about this and the mentality that you would have to have at that moment, there's no point in staying there. It's do or die, and you may die anyway, but there's no point in standing still. And I think that's really the essence of death ground, coming back to Sun Tzu, is that a person is put into a situation where there's no point in standing still anymore, where people are called upon to make the decision to move. The only positive decision is to move into the unknown, and to become something greater for however much time you have. Not to be a part of the old ways, or to be stuck in a groove, doing the same thing, thinking the same way. But to step out into unknown territory, not knowing exactly what will happen, but knowing the goal is actually victory. Victory in life, if not for themselves, at least for others, is the goal. The reason why we remember these people is because there's something extraordinary about them. And there are times in all of our lives when we may be called to that type of extraordinary character. That's why it's important to learn from Sun Tzu and other thinkers about these situations so that we can think ahead of time about how we will respond to death ground.